Welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm your host, Ramita Iyer, Research Analyst at the Institute. Last month, the Indian government announced the resumption of Vaccine Maitri, an ambitious diplomatic effort to export vaccines to India's neighbours and key partners beyond the region. To tell us more about the initiative and the implications of its resumption, we have with us today Dr. Karthik Nachiappan, Research Fellow at ISAS, whose area of focus includes India and global health. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Nachiappan.
Thank you so much for having me.
India's Vaccine Maitri initiative was first launched in January 2021, but it was quickly suspended in April. Can you give us a timeline of what happened between January and April this year?
In early 2021, as you mentioned, India commenced its ambitious vaccine diplomacy initiative, or Vaccine Maitri, that has now shipped around 65 million doses of Covaxin and Covishield that were produced internally in India to countries all over the world. From January to mid-March, if you remember, not more than a few days passed between major vaccine shipments leaving India on different flights. This was done with much fanfare, but it also received some criticism. A lot of people questioned why the government was shipping much needed vaccines abroad when Indians were still getting COVID and were still dying. India's vaccine needs were not fulfilled either, but the government was focused on sending these shipments abroad, both commercially and as donations. And I suspect the government decided to pursue Vaccine Maitri for two reasons. First, they thought they had space to donate and sell vaccines abroad, even though cases were rising and vaccinations were quite slow and the number of cases small, relatively small. And this was probably because the Serum Institute was producing vaccines at a faster rate than India's inoculation program could then handle, which left extras for both donations and exports. So there was a calculation made then that the cases would not rise exponentially through 2021, and that production will only increase, and that both objectives, internal immunization and external vaccine shipments, could then go ahead. And second, the calculus was probably that many lower and middle income countries had no real alternative other than India to get affordable and accessible vaccines, just as the pandemic was beginning to accelerate with new variants, especially Delta. Many countries across the world, poorer ones in particular, were counting on India to deliver vaccines, particularly just as vaccine nationalism was heating up across the world, with Western countries buying up stocks well in advance. Obviously, this situation became untenable as COVID cases skyrocketed in India from April onward. And it became clear then that vaccines and their administration domestically was the only pathway to reduce the effects of the pandemic and eventually conquer it. I think the pandemic caught up with India in early 2021 and its vaccine diplomacy.
So what was the impact of the suspension of the initiative, both in terms of delivery as well as India's relations with its partners?
So it caused a lot of problems for a lot of countries, especially lower and middle income countries that relied on India's low cost vaccines that could be stored without too much refrigeration. Now, remember, both Moderna and Pfizer, their vaccines were not necessarily affordable for most countries in the world, and their storage was a lot more onerous than the vaccines that India had produced. So which made Indian vaccines far more attractive for the global south. If you take a couple of countries just in the region, right, and see the impact there, Nepal, for example, has had to halt its vaccination campaign. It was heavily reliant on doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine that was made at the Serum Institute. And with its national stockpile running low in early 2021, Nepal stopped administering vaccines in early March. Nepal actually received a donation of around 1 million doses from the Indian government and had, if I recall, already paid nearly 80% of the price for the next 2 million doses. But they didn't obviously get that. In terms of what the effect had on India-Nepal relations, I think relations were beginning to thaw between India and Nepal after a few problematic years. And vaccines were initially thought of as a way to normalize ties. And this was not just a foreign policy issue for India. It was also a domestic one, since informally, people frequently crossed the border from Nepal to India. And so being unvaccinated was also a risk, given that COVID could actually spread faster with an open border. But that obviously didn't happen, right? If you look at another country in South Asia, Sri Lanka, which was also very badly affected early on from COVID, and with relations between India and Sri Lanka were not really in the best of terms over the last few years, and so vaccines were probably one way through which to engineer some sort of a rapprochement in the relationship ever since Gotabaya took office after the elections. But I mean, since Gotabaya has come to office, I think Delhi has struggled in many ways to straighten relations with Sri Lanka, particularly to get the Sri Lankan government to commit to a deal that his predecessor signed to complete a project and the Colombo port that was partly developed by India. At that time, while large Chinese projects continued, the Rajapaksa government opened this particular Indian deal for further review to the chagrin of the Indian government. So hoping to stress the importance of this particular Colombo project, India dispatched nearly 500,000 vaccine doses to Sri Lanka in early 2021. Sri Lanka had also placed a purchase order for about 18 million doses thereafter from the Serum Institute. And so after the deal and after the initial Indian shipment, the Indian media treated both these accomplishments as a diplomatic victory. And it seemed sort of somewhat apparent then that Sri Lanka would largely depend on India for vaccines going ahead. But just then, the Sri Lankan government also received another gift of vaccines from China, a pledge to donate about 300,000 doses just at the time when the Indian government sent its own shipments. So these dueling donations are just a part of, I think, a much larger diplomatic dance that's unfolding in South Asia. And vaccines have come to affect that in a important but also different way. So what happened after that between India and Sri Lanka? The Rajapaksa cabinet, what happened after the Indian government donated vaccines and then the Chinese government also followed with vaccines? The Rajapaksa cabinet decided that that Sri Lanka was developing the Colombo terminal port on its own, pushing India out of the project. So vaccines didn't really have much of a diplomatic effect on India-Sri Lanka relations. So these are just two countries in South Asia, if you look on how vaccines or could affect not just how specific countries are tackling COVID, but also the broader relationship that India has with these countries. I think besides these two countries, it's also important to grasp the importance or the impact of India's vaccine suspension on COVAX, the multilateral vaccine facility. Nearly 3/4 of the initial doses sent from COVAX in early 2021 to lower and middle income countries came from a production center in India. Gavi, which had been one of the founding partners of COVAX, has had a long-standing partnership with the Serum Institute and had initially signed an agreement for it to supply COVAX with 1 billion doses. more than 100 million were due before May 2021 from the Serum Institute to COVAX for lower and middle income countries. And all these doses were affected since India, because of the second wave, could not ship them out. And so there's been a larger multilateral effect as well from the suspension of India's Vaccine Maitri. And Gavi has not been able to successfully get additional vaccines from other countries, given that they had really relied greatly on the Serum Institute in particular to provide those supplies. But there is hope now that since the suspension has been lifted, that the Serum Institute would hopefully deliver its fair share of vaccines to COVAX as well.
You briefly mentioned China's vaccine donations to Sri Lanka, but they've engaged in aggressive vaccine diplomacy in other countries in the region and beyond as well. In what ways is this different or similar to India's efforts?
So I think there are a lot of differences. And more often when we read about India and China's vaccine diplomacy through the media or reporting, they're often presented as similar, but they are not actually very similar. There are quite a few differences here. The first difference is how they characterize it. Right? China has denied that it's engaging in vaccine diplomacy. And it says, and it has repeatedly said, that it is supplying vaccine aid. And China considers its vaccines as a global public good. Right? So it's not something that it's doing to the benefit of Chinese foreign policy, but to the benefit of global health writ large. I think regardless of what China calls it, it's no doubt that the Chinese government has made a dent globally through its vaccine exports. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced this week that the official count is that the Chinese government had delivered around 1 billion vaccine doses to more than 100 countries during the pandemic, which is quite a large number compared to not just India but a lot of the other countries. Whereas for India, I think the diplomatic aspects have been emphasized relative to the impact of vaccines on global health as a whole. And here we need to dig deeper and understand why that is. Right? Is it because India has had problems in its neighborhood and in other parts of the world, and it's looking at improving its relations with many countries through vaccines? Possibly, which is why maybe its emphasis on the diplomatic aspects of vaccines have been quite prevalent. But I think vaccines also enhances India's role as a reliable crisis responder and as a solutions provider to countries within its own neighborhood going ahead. And that's something that India has not really played much of a role of in the recent past. Is that of being a public goods provider within the region, and vaccines clearly allowed India to undertake that role. So one difference is how each country has characterized it. Another clear difference is efficacy and foundation. I think Chinese vaccines do work, but they work less effectively and efficiently than the vaccines that are produced in India and a lot of the other Western countries. Of the vaccines that are developed in China, the WHO calls Sinovac doses 51% effective against COVID infections, and Sinopharm around 79% effective. So this is clearly not at the range at which some of the other mRNA vaccines are, right? So that's another difference. Another difference is that the process through which vaccines are developed and distributed to other countries. So China has a top-down enterprise with a lot of the SOEs at the forefront, with a government leading, that can cut deals with other countries on vaccines without much due process or without thinking too much about the commercial and administrative wranglings. Whereas in India, the private pharma companies like the Serum Institute have been playing much more of a leading role in deciding the terms and conditions under which vaccines are especially sold to other countries and how they're distributed. So they have a much greater role in India's own vaccine apparatus than the pharma companies in China. So that's another difference. I think geographically, their vaccine exports also differ. So if you look at it in Asia, China has been busy shipping vaccines much closer to home. That's largely in Southeast Asia. 9 out of the 10 ASEAN countries are on track to receive and use Chinese vaccines. So for instance, Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore have all either bought or received Chinese vaccines, and some have used them predominantly, or some to a lesser extent. Whereas for India, it's geographically it's a lot more spread out. South Asia is obviously one clear focus, but some of the other countries in Africa, in Latin America, in Central America have all received Indian vaccines. So geographically, there is a difference there as well. So there are a lot more differences than there are, I think, similarities. Whereas the similarities, whereas in the media, as I mentioned, we all often present both their efforts as somewhat similar, but they're not.
At the Quad Leaders Summit in September, US President Biden announced that the Quad vaccine partnership is on track to achieve its production targets. What do you make of this commitment to produce an additional 1 billion doses in India, especially given that India's contribution in terms of vaccine doses has so far been the lowest among the 4 partner countries? And also, what are the likely regional implications of the Quad's focus on vaccines?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, in April 2021, an agreement was signed between the US and 3 of its Indo-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, and India, to produce up to 1 billion COVID-19 vaccines by the end of 2022, largely to supply to other Asian countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia. I think leading up to that, India had urged its Quad partners to invest in its vaccine production capacity in an attempt to counter China's widening vaccine diplomacy, particularly in Southeast Asia. And I think this was one effort to do that. But I think independent of China, there was also a need for the Quad to focus their energies and efforts on vaccines to promote technology transfer of safe and effective vaccines in other parts of the world, especially mRNA vaccines, and to strengthen the manufacturing capacity in other parts of Asia to meet rising needs, just as COVID was spreading. So even operationally, there was a need to decentralize vaccine production and to share the technologies of that effort in an open and transparent manner, and that was one big more motivation behind the Quad's focus on vaccines as well. I think there was a clear reflection also that COVID-19 was still here and would still be here for the next few years. So it was important to diversify production and decentralize it in an effective and efficient manner, such that a lot of countries not reliant on 1 or 2 suppliers going ahead, as we've seen from India's own experience this year when the second wave hit. But 6 months later, from that April 2021 announcement, I think the sun has yet to rise on the Quad's vaccine efforts. I think India's continued restrictions on vaccine exports have all but choked off its ability to um, deliver vaccines in Southeast Asia, but also in other parts of the world. The US, meanwhile, has sent very small amounts of vaccine donations uh, to the Indo-Pacific specifically. So Vietnam has received a few million doses. Thailand received a couple of million. Cambodia and Laos have also received a million or so. Japan has tried to fill the gap here, donating a few million doses, while Australia, given its own slow domestic vaccination efforts, has not really contributed much by way of donation. So the Quad's individual efforts here uh, are still quite measly compared to their collective goal, and have not really come close to matching China's vaccine campaign so far. And I think India's lifting of its export restrictions could help kickstart this campaign. I think that move was clearly a welcome relief to the Biden administration. That's locked up its own vaccine stockpile of more than 100 million doses for a potential booster shot campaign at home. So the Quad really has to really get going, both on the production side and on the delivery side, if they're going to make a dent anytime soon, especially before 2022.
Moving forward with the resumption of the Vaccine Maitri initiative, do you think that India still has an opportunity to improve goodwill among its neighbors and other key partners? Or like you mentioned, does India have the opportunity to become the reliable public goods provider in the region? And will India's domestic vaccination rates allow for success of the initiative this time?
I think many countries in South and Southeast Asia will be hoping that India can step up, especially given the low rates of vaccinations across both South and Southeast Asia. While around 54% of the Indian population has received at least one dose, that figure is much lower in other parts of South Asia. So only 24% in Nepal, for example, have received a single dose. And it's much lesser in the other countries, Bangladesh and Pakistan, where less than, I think, 15% have received a single dose. So clearly the opportunity is there for India to play a bigger role, especially in shipping vaccines. While the Modi government has promised to vaccinate all Indians by the end of the year, only 25% have been fully vaccinated so far. And experts do, I think, believe that India will need to at least administer or produce and administer at least 10 million doses a day to achieve that target, which the government had set out. And that would mean at least producing 300 million doses a month, far beyond what India has been able to produce so far, because the monthly output of the Serum Institute right now is only around 200 million. So the production demands to complete domestic inoculation in India are still quite steep. I think that would be the first priority going ahead. And I think India will also have to find a balance between its domestic vaccination efforts that I just mentioned and its vaccine exports, which will be required given the rate of vaccinations across Asia in particular. I think the more India delays these exports, the more likely it will lose goodwill. But that risk equally also applies, perhaps more seriously, if India promises doses to its neighbors and then reneges for want of supply at home. So that balance has to be carefully managed going forward. But I think this is not India's job alone, right? And high-income countries have also pledged to share close to 2 billion doses with low-income countries. but so far only about 15% of these jabs have been sent, which is a shockingly low number. The resumption of vaccine exports from India from October onward cannot be another excuse for Western countries, for these advanced industrialized countries who already have high vaccination rates, with some already running booster campaigns, to further delay supplying doses to low-income countries, and thereby prolonging the pandemic even longer. So India clearly has a responsibility, given its own capacity at home, to produce both Covishield and Covax. But I think it's equally the responsibility of other high-income countries to share more of their doses going ahead, to ensure that vaccination rates increase across the developing world.
Thank you for sharing your insights today, Dr. Nachiappan.
Thank you.
You were listening to South Asia Chat. To know more about our work, visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also follow our social media pages on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.